My fingers clenched the cedar seat as the bus took another tight turn, and a nauseating sensation twisted through my gut. It felt like someone had been ripping my stomach from my body all morning. I figured the driver hadn't gotten the memo about the value of a school bus filled with students. I glanced at Tom sitting next to me. No surprise, he was doing a better job of maintaining his composure than I was. The winding mountain road was torturing him as well, but he masked it better. Tom and I had been victims of a horrific car accident at the tender ages of 7 and 8. Ever since that crash, any ride in a slightly unsafe vehicle was certain to be misery for both of us. It happened exactly 10 years earlier to the day. Our single mother had been driving us home from school, running late and leaving us in the sweltering heat to wait. I sat next to her in the old station wagon, having beaten Tom in a race for the front seat. I was sweaty, trying to keep cool with my arm draped out the open window. We had just passed the sign for our exit when I was deafened by my mother's scream before the impending collision. I caught a glimpse of a small schoolgirl walking into the lane ahead of us. My mother slammed on the brakes and swerved the car to the left in a state of panic. We smashed into the transport truck beside us, and the car launched weightlessly off the highway shoulder. My vision blurred, and I heard nothing but a piercing, high-pitched ring in my ears. Dazed, I felt Tom shaking the seat behind me. His shout was faint behind the constant buzz, urging me to get out. He reached over my shoulder and pointed forward. Flames crept from beneath the deformed car hood. I wiggled my thin body out the open window and onto the hot pavement, immediately collapsing atop a broken ankle. Broken glass sliced my hands open as I tried to collect myself against the barrier. Tom managed to pull himself out of the rear passenger window and came to help. The flames from the engine had grown considerably. In disbelief, I looked toward our mother. Her contorted body was plastered to the driver's seat. Tom, fighting through debris, rounded to her side of the car. The car frame had caved in, and through the remnants of an open window, we saw her pinned down, life flickering in her eyes. She turned towards us, moving her lips to speak, but I couldn't make out the words. I only heard the high-pitched buzzing and the sounds of approaching sirens. Tom dropped me and desperately tried to pry open what remained of the car door. Tears streamed down his face as he pulled at the door that could no longer open. The heat from the fire grew more intense, but the emotional stress far outweighed any sense of physical danger. I crawled along the shards of broken glass, getting as close as I could to where my mother was trapped. Kneeling on bloodied knees, I brought myself to eye level with her. With what I imagine was her last shred of strength, she reached a broken arm out the window towards me. I reached my tiny bloodied arm towards her, and for a moment, our hands met. It was the last time we touched. It was the last time I saw my mother alive. Seconds later, I was yanked back into the arms of a fireman. The last image burned into my mind was the blaze, fire shooting upwards as they closed the ambulance doors. Years later, Tom broke down crying as he described the sound of our mother screaming in pain, the flames engulfing her. I'm sure I would have cried with him if I could have heard anything clearly that day. This disoriented memory drifts through my mind, its truth a haunting echo for only Tom and me. We alone recount the story of swerving to dodge a small girl on the highway, but others at the site claim they pulled our unconscious bodies from the wreckage after being T-boned by an SUV at an intersection. We had never even gotten on the highway. Make no mistake, Tom and I struggled mightily with the idea of getting on that bus as high school students that day, 10 years later. But we chose to attend the field trip up the mountain on the anniversary of our mother's death. We thought we could hide the sickness that would rip us apart inside. The field trip was for our biology course, an annual event for local schools to give kids a hands-on look at the local ecosystems. For Tom and me, it was a chance to mingle. At the rendezvous point, we intentionally placed ourselves at the back of our class line, knowing some of us would spill over onto another school's bus. That particular school had a reputation for having an excess of beautiful girls. My brother and I were the last to board their bus, and we were not disappointed. The ride up the mountain turned out to be bumpier than anticipated. Sitting at the back, we struggled to keep our stomachs. We figured the feeling would pass, but it never did. After about half an hour, Tom decided he had enough. He took a deep breath, forced a recognizable fake smile, and stumbled a few rows forward, carefully gripping the top of each seat for balance. He flexed his triceps with each grab for support, finally sitting beside two pretty brunettes. I heard him trying to break the ice with a bogus story about the previous year's class trip. From my view, it looked like it was working, even as he held his stomach. Somehow he remained entertaining. That day, I wished he hadn't tried. My competitive nature gnawed at me to do something, but I felt too out of it to act. I looked out at the mountain terrain as the bus took another turn, forcing me to brace myself against the seat. I kept my eyes on the pale gray sky and the matching cliff walls above me, trying to drown out the sound of the rattling floor. After a while, it seemed to work, and I felt slightly more at ease. I allowed my gaze to drift back inside, scanning the class of unfamiliar students in front of me. I saw many girls, mostly sitting in groups of 2 or 3. I looked over at my brother, who had clearly made an impression on the girls he sat with. He was now in full conversation, somehow charming them effortlessly. I doubted I could achieve a similar outcome. That's when my eyes caught something intriguing. She sat alone in the seat behind the driver. From her side profile, I could tell she was stunning, with straight blonde hair that rested just below her shoulders. To me, she was even more attractive than the girls my brother was chatting with, and I knew he would agree if he saw her. It surprised me to see her sitting alone. It didn't make sense to my 17-year-old mind why a girl like that would be on her own, but it worked to my advantage. It made her seem more vulnerable. I kept my eyes on her for too long, unable to resist. Almost on cue, she turned around and caught me red-handed. The expression on her face made it clear she knew I had been watching her the whole time. She gave me a familiar smile, and I immediately dropped my head to the floor, embarrassment washing over me. Worse yet, the sickness in my stomach returned, worse than before. I became a complete wreck, head down in my lap. Dread slowly crept into my mind as I stared downwards, wishing I had just skipped the trip and stayed home. I would have done anything to be back in my bed. The bus continued to make sharp turns as we wound our way up the mountain. Staring at the ground was proving no help. I decided to focus on the stretch of road through the front windshield, trying to anticipate the paralyzing bends. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The road ahead was coming to an abrupt end, due for an immediate turn to the left, and we were headed for what looked like a free fall off the mountain. The bus driver was fiddling with the radio, not paying attention. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Turn!" A moment of communal panic erupted on the bus as everyone realized where we were headed. The driver jerked the wheel hard to the left, and it screeched in protest. I felt no sickness, just the calm feeling of inevitable death. The bus skidded towards the guardrail, hitting it hard. The rusted barrier bent but didn't break, stretching back as the bus partially went over the edge. I was sure the wheel beneath me had no ground below it. The bus swayed gently from a gust of wind that passed by. I looked down to see a perfectly still lake 50 feet below us. I couldn't believe we hadn't fallen. The driver cautiously applied the gas, and by some miracle, the left wheel found enough traction. Slowly, the bus crept forward until all the wheels were on solid ground. I felt no sickness, no fury as we got back on the road. I couldn't feel anything at all. We stopped at a rest area a few kilometers down the road. The other class's teacher was in a shouting match with the bus driver, who refused to continue to our destination. He wanted another bus to come and bring us back down the mountain, and all the students agreed that was best. I sat alone on a picnic table, farthest from everyone, not in the mood for talking. Raindrops scattered on my head, but it didn't bother me. The numb feeling from nearly going over the edge of the mountain still gripped me. If you had asked me before how nearly dying in a second vehicle accident would make me feel, I would not have guessed that I would feel nothing at all. My body was trembling slightly, but my mind was strangely calm. It was as if my body knew we'd nearly died, but my brain hadn't caught on yet. Tom stood talking with the two girls he had sat with on the bus, his arm draped over one of them, his tone soft and reassuring. It surprised me. I couldn't understand how he was still focused on pursuing those girls after what had just happened. I, on the other hand, was officially done with everything. I just wanted to leave, along with the majority of the students lounging around the rest area. I had no interest in getting back on that bus with the same driver. I would have walked back down the mountain if I had to. The blonde girl I'd seen earlier was leaning against the side of the bus, alone once again. Much to my surprise, when I looked in her direction, I met her gaze. This time, it was me who had caught her staring. The difference was, instead of cowering down or looking away, she kept her eyes locked on mine without hesitation. She started to walk towards me. There was nothing visibly distraught about her demeanor. She had the same calm smile she had flashed me on the bus. I tried to keep my legs from trembling as she came to sit down beside me. "Did you think we were going to die?" she asked. It was hardly the introduction I was expecting. I tried not to sound surprised as I answered. "For a minute, yeah, but it's not that big of a deal. We weren't that high up from the lake. We might have even survived the fall. I knew we were going to die," she said. "Have you ever been in a car accident before?" I would have much preferred to talk about anything else. Talking about my previous car accident was the last thing I wanted to dwell on. "Yes," I answered after a pause. "Have you ever been in a car accident before?" "Not exactly," she said, "but I've been close." I was trying to figure out why this girl was talking to me about this. It was the most awkward initial conversation I had ever had. "Listen," she said before I could respond. "I was here before, a long time ago with my mother. There's something really cool I want to show you, just a bit up that trail." She pointed behind us to a path leading into some woods. With her other hand, she squeezed the leg I had been trying to keep from trembling. "Come with me. It's like nothing you've ever seen before. I promise it'll shock you more than what happened today." I was even more taken aback by her offer than when she first approached me. Behind her, I could see Tom looking back at me with a grin on his face. He had noticed our little encounter and flashed me a quick wink before returning to the girls next to him. She had caught my attention, albeit in a strange way. It was going to take at least 2 hours for another bus to come and pick us up, and I had nothing else to do. Despite how strange her offer was, I didn't have a legitimate reason to turn her down. I think pretty much any 17-year-old guy would take the opportunity to sneak off with a girl like that. She never loosened her grip on my arm as we jogged into the woods together. I guess the teacher and everyone else didn't notice or care that we left. Nobody followed or even called out. We walked along the path through the tall cedar trees. Small puddles were forming in the dirt from the light, persistent rain. After about 2 minutes, she pulled us off the trail altogether. We scraped through the untreated thicket. I asked if she was sure she knew where she was going, but she didn't answer. Finally, we broke through the forest and reached a clearing. Foam clung to the ground in eerie patches, with tufts of grass sticking up through the rocks. I figured the fog was due to our high elevation. The clearing led upwards towards a plateau about 30 feet up. When we reached the top, we found a perfectly smooth stone surface. Right in the middle stood an old picnic bench, its presence there an unsettling mystery. She finally let go of my arm and motioned me towards the bench. She took a seat on the far end and beckoned me to join her with a gesture of her hand. Nervously, I approached and sat across from her. The fog was so thick on the plateau that you could hardly see more than a few feet off the cliff. Given our height, I imagined the drop-off was enormous, and under normal circumstances I would have felt a crippling sense of vertigo. "Do you want to be here?" she asked, raising her arms and resting her elbows on the table, her palms open towards me. "Do you want to be here?" She repeated ... I guess," I hesitated. "Put your hands against mine," she said. "I'm going to show you something." I paused, looking her in the eye, realizing that I hadn't even gotten her name yet. She gave me that familiar, reassuring smile again, and I had no idea what to expect. I rested my elbows on the table in front of me and placed my hands against hers. The transition was seamless. Instantly, I was back on the school bus. Outside was faintly lit by the pale gray sky. Confused, I looked up and saw my brother talking to the brunette girls a few rows in front of me. At the front of the bus, I could see the blonde girl in the seat behind the driver. She was alone, facing forward. Everything was exactly as it had been on the ride up. I started to feel the same physical sensations again, but this time they were much worse. First, a crippling sickness in my stomach, then the dull ache in my ankle. I dropped my head almost to my lap, trying to suppress the pain. Just above the back of the seat in front of me, I could see through the windshield. We were headed towards the sharp bend in the road again, just like before. The driver's attention was focused on the radio. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. A high-pitched buzzing filled my ears. Some girls near the front screamed a moment later, but it was too late. We broke through the barrier and flew off the edge of the cliff. The calm, soothing feeling of inevitable death washed over me again, only to be shattered by the horrific sensation of my body being crushed as we hit the water. Suddenly, I was back at the picnic table. My hands were resting against hers. The grin on her face now seemed so much less innocent and sincere. Before I could even move, the seamless transition occurred again. This time, I found myself somewhere else. I could feel the heat of the sun above me, the burning of my feet on the pavement below. My ankle lost all strength, and I fell to my knees. Shards of broken glass sliced my hands open. In front of me was the wreckage of my mother's old station wagon. Her arm was outstretched to the mangled doorframe. I reached out to touch it, but it was always just out of reach, no matter how far I crawled or stretched. Her face was broken and bleeding, and she let out a scream that pierced through the ringing in my ears. The blood-curdling sound was the worst thing I had ever heard. I realized how fortunate I was to not have been able to hear it the first time as a child. I looked at the sky and tried to scream with all the agony that had welled up inside me, but again, no sound came out. My vision started to blur. I looked back at my mother, trying to bring her back into focus. From behind the car, I could see the faint silhouette of a little blonde schoolgirl standing and watching us. The transition happened before I could even realize it, and once again, I was seated on the bench. The emotional anguish of watching my mother die was still pulsing through my body. It felt like I was frozen in place, unable to pull my hands away from this girl as she continued to grin at me. The look in her eyes seemed less human than before. I felt someone grasp my wrist, and when I turned, I saw the blonde girl sitting beside me on the back of the bus. We had transitioned again. Ahead of us was that sharp turn, the driver still distracted as we hurtled towards it. She posed the question to me just as we were about to break through the guardrail. "Do you want to be here?" I had no time to answer. I wouldn't have been able to make a sound even if I could. The numbing feeling of impending death quickly ended with the sensation of my body being shattered as the bus hit the lake. Immediately, we were back at the bench. The fog that surrounded us had grown thicker. My breaths were deep, and my body continued to ache. I looked helplessly at whatever was masked as the blonde girl in front of me. Then I was back to the wreckage and back to the table. Back to the bus and back to the table. Endlessly, round and round, she took me. She forced me to relive the same two memories, always interrupted by a brief trip to the picnic bench in between. The minute details would always change. Sometimes I would see her. Sometimes I would see him. Sometimes it would be a little farther back or forward in time, but the events were always carried out the same way. The pain I felt was always the same, and she wouldn't even let me make a sound. I experienced the misery of watching my mother die and the trauma of being crushed as I hit the water in a cycle that felt infinite. I want to tell you that the pain started to ease as I continued to live through them, but it didn't. It compounded. After countless cycles, something finally changed. There came a time where it was just her and me on the bus, cruising without a driver towards the edge of the cliff. She gripped my arm again and posed the question, "Do you want to be here?" For the first time in forever, the words I formed actually made a sound, "No." "Just one last thing to see," she responded with that grin I had come to resent with all my being. The final transition brought me somewhere else entirely. From the picnic bench, I was suddenly on a rocky beach, looking out over a perfectly still mountain lake. The surface was a beautiful deep blue, contrasting with the gray sky above. Gigantic mountain walls surrounded the undisturbed body of water on all sides. I felt the same feeling I had when the bus nearly crashed the first time, a fleeting moment of contentment. The silence was quickly broken by the sound of screeching bus tires above me. I looked up and saw the sharp turn on the road just above the lake. The school bus crashed through the barrier and began its nosedive downwards. For a moment, everything slowed. I saw the bus suspended in midair, faintly hearing the screams of those inside. Among them, I could hear Tom screaming at the top of his lungs. The distress in his voice stood out among the rest. Time resumed its normal pace, and the bus crashed into the water. A wave rippled out from where it landed. The tail end with the last rows of seats popped back above the surface, floating gently in place before beginning its slow descent back into the water. All serenity was gone. From behind me, I heard the soft footsteps of the blonde girl approaching. I heard a familiar voice, an echo from somewhere deep within, urging me, "Go out and save him. There's still time." Without hesitation, I plunged into the icy water, breaking into a desperate swim as the lake's depths swallowed my legs. The bus hadn't crashed too far out. Maybe, just maybe, I could reach it. I arrived just as the last rows of seats were disappearing beneath the surface. My brother was there, in the back, reaching his hands through the open window. Our eyes met, and the suffering in his gaze was beyond anything I could comprehend. I stretched out my hand to pull him to safety, but he was just out of reach. The bus sank beneath the surface, dragging him down with it. I dove after it, but everything vanished into the depths. It all happened so fast. I found myself floating alone in the calmness of the water. I turned back towards the shore and saw the familiar blonde figure standing there. It was off-center, its posture inhuman, an eerie silhouette against the fading light. I closed my eyes, intending to scream, but I was met with the same frustrating silence. When I opened them again, I was home, in bed. Below me, I could hear my foster mother crying. I flew out of bed and ran downstairs. She couldn't even meet my eyes as she spoke. The bus that Tom was on crashed. It hit a lake. They can't find anyone. There was no logical aftermath or reasoning to what had actually taken place. In whatever version of reality I now found myself, I never got on the bus that day. I never even went to school. Instead, I faked feeling ill and stayed home in bed. The thought of a trip with my mom made me nauseous, and I had decided not to go. The bus crashed through the barrier at that same bend in the road. The driver, the teacher, and all 22 students on board were killed. The true cause of the crash was never determined. Since that day, I haven't stepped into a vehicle. There hasn't been a single night that I've slept soundly. Every time I close my eyes, I relive the crash, or I watch my mother's death. The sequence, the pain, and the emotions are etched perfectly in my mind. Yet apparently, none of it ever happened, not in this timeline at least. There was nothing left in this world for that thing to take from me. No experience I could imagine would be worse to relive. But sometimes, as I lay sleepless at night, I can't help but wonder, maybe there is another version of myself somewhere who had to endure things so much worse than I did. Perhaps there is another me who suffers so much more. However, one thing is certain: I don't want to be here.